All right. Well, welcome everyone to the Roundabout Books Tuesday virtual author night. So my name is Julie. I'm the events manager at Roundabout. So before we get started with tonight's event, I just wanted to remind everyone to check our event calendar online or on our Facebook to find out about upcoming events and book clubs. I wanted to remind you that this Thursday, in 2 days, Oregon author Annie Lund will be in the store to talk about her debut book, The Boy with a Bird in His Chest. This is only our second event in our new space, and we're really excited for everyone to see it, so please come on down. And then on April 30th, during Indie Bookstore Day, we are welcoming 6 Oregon authors to the store from 12 p.m. to 2 p.m., where they will be at designated tables so that you can find out about their books. We're calling it Speed Date with an Oregon Author. And as some of you might know, we are expanding and renovating, so just make sure to check our website in case there are days that we might be closed to finish those up. We're almost done, but the store is still in a little bit of a construction phase, so always check that. And then just want to remind everyone about Zoom. Stay muted while our guests are speaking, but obviously we want to see your lovely faces so you can have your video on. And then towards the end, when we get ready for the Q&A, I can either unmute you or you can put your question in the chat and then I can read it out for our 2 guests. And all of our recorded events are on our YouTube channel going back to May of 2020, which feels so much longer ago than just 2 years. So tonight we are so excited to talk about a book, a record-breaking woman, and a wonderful new art installation in Bend. So joining us is Valerie Yost from Brooks-Resources and Peter Zheutlin, author of Spin, Around the World on 2 Wheels, and Rescue Road, among several more. So I know we have a lot to talk about because we have so much that's related to everything here. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, Valerie, to just go ahead and get us started.
Great. Thank you so much, Julie. I am so pleased to be here. Again, my name is Valerie Yost, and I'm the marketing director for Discovery West. That's a new neighborhood just west of Northwest Crossing here in Bend, Oregon. And I think this event is such a great way to conclude Women's History Month, celebrating the amazing achievements that women and contributions that women have made and continue to make around the world. About 3 years ago, our development team was contemplating our future Discovery West neighborhood. And one of the fun aspects of my job is I get to name streets. And we wanted to play off the theme of discovery, and our thoughts turned to all of the famous, well-known discoverers throughout history: Magellan, Galileo, Cousteau, and we quickly realized they were all men. And what about some of those lesser known discoverers? Tharp, Mayer, Ochoa, Londonderry. These women contributed significant discoveries themselves, yet they're not household names. So I'm proud to say that all of the new streets in Discovery West are named after women who have made history with their discoveries in space, the seas, medicine, technology, and in Annie Londonderry's case, across the globe on a bicycle. In my research about Annie's life, I stumbled upon Peter's name and the first book he wrote about Annie, his great-grand-aunt. When I reached out to him asking if it would be okay if we honored his great-grand-aunt with a street named after her, he was so gracious. And we soon plotted a day that he would come to Bend and collaborate on an event. And while he's not joining us in person tonight, I have no doubt that he'll make it to Bend one day to stand on Londonderry Place. I'm so grateful to Roundabout Books for hosting this wonderful event with us. So thank you. Earlier today, we hosted an art dedication in collaboration with Bend Park and Recreation District. And we commissioned this fine-looking gentleman, Chris Cole, to create a sculpture that would be at home on Londonderry Place and pay homage to Annie's incredible life and adventures. And I encourage you to seek it out on your next venture into Discovery West. I think it will carry even more significance after tonight's presentation by Peter. And on the Discovery West YouTube channel, we have a video that documents the creation of this art piece. So please find us on all the social channels, Discovery West Bend. We are so grateful to Chris Cole for his talents and passion for this project, and he is tuning in right now. And because we've turned him into an Annie Londonderry groupie. So we're excited to have him with us. And I thought, Peter, for your benefit, we would show you what Londonderry Place looks like. We actually currently have 3 residents living on Londonderry Place right now. with a few more to come under construction. So again, we hope to have you visit us in Bend soon. And I have one more picture. This was the art dedication we hosted this morning. And we appreciated everybody that came out for that. So now I have the honor of introducing tonight's presenter, Peter Zheutlin. Peter is a freelance journalist and author whose work has appeared regularly in the Boston Globe and the Christian Science Monitor. Peter has also written for the Los Angeles Times, Parade Magazine, AARP Magazine, and numerous other publications in the US and abroad. He is the author of 9 books, including the New York Times bestseller, Rescue Road, One Man, 30,000 Dogs, and 1,000,000 Miles on the Last Hope Highway, and Rescued, What Second Chance Dogs Teach Us About Living with Purpose, Loving with Abandon, and Finding Joy in the Little Things. And of course, his first book about his ancestor, Around the World on 2 Wheels, Annie Londonderry's Extraordinary Ride. Is it just me, or does it sound like Peter would fit in really well in Bend with our bike and dog-centric lifestyles? Peter's newest book, Spin, is his first novel, a work of historical fiction based on the true story of his great-grandaunt, who circled the world by bicycle at a time when, well, let's just say women didn't do such things. A graduate of Amherst College and Boston College Law School, Peter resides in Massachusetts with his wife, Judith Gelman, who is also an accomplished author. Thank you for being here, Peter. I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Thanks so much, Valerie, and thanks everyone in Bend for being here, and in Seattle and Boston, wherever you're located. And thanks to Brooks-Resources for honoring Annie in this way. I was really tickled when I got Valerie's email a few years ago. And thanks to Chris for a very inspired piece of artwork. I have not been able to peer in it, Chris, but I've been told what's in it. And the way it sort of pays homage to the bicycle and to steamships of the era is really quite something. And thanks to Roundabout Books for hosting this event. Please buy books from your independent local bookseller and support them if you can. I'm really excited to share this chapter of both women's history and my own family history. But this is a story that was completely lost for over a century until I stumbled upon it. And I'm going to do 4 things tonight. And we've got to go around the world in a short order. I'm going to tell you how I stumbled onto this story, because it was not a piece of family lore. I want to tell you who the woman at the center of this story is, who became famous as Annie Londonderry, a pseudonym. I want to tell you a little bit about the social and historical context in which this bike ride took place, because to understand how an anonymous Jewish woman from Boston could become an international celebrity without the benefit of Instagram or Twitter really requires you to understand a little bit about the social historical context. And then finally, I'm going to very briefly take you through parts of the trip itself. When I wrote that first book, Around the World on 2 Wheels, that was nonfiction, and it was published in 2007. It hardly was a barn burner in terms of sales, but over the years, to my surprise, this story has rippled out in the most unexpected ways. It's been the subject of 3 musicals, one produced in Toronto that's at the top called Spin, another in London called Ride, and most recently, a theater production in Italy. And we've been, my wife particularly, because she's more social media savvy than I, all kinds of artwork has been popping up on Instagram from around the world. In the upper corner there, upper left, that's in Valencia, Spain. I don't know where some of these others originated, but just to give you an idea of how this story has kind of rippled out in many ways. There's a clothing line someone developed. On the bottom left, you see that's a essential oil from some company in London. A French soap maker did a cameo soap with her image on it. But I have to say that this is probably the most unusual way that it's rippled out, is to have a street named after Annie in Bend, and I have no doubt that she'd be absolutely thrilled about that. So how did I find out about this? In 1993, my mother got a letter from a complete stranger. He said he was a researcher. He was researching the story of the first woman to bike around the world. She called herself Annie Londonderry. And he had done some genealogy research, which led him to believe that my mother might be related to her. And the way he laid it out in the letter, it was absolutely clear that he had found the right family. He identified people my mother recognized, but my mother had never heard of her great aunt Annie, and she knew nothing about a bicycle trip. In that letter were enclosed two newspaper articles, one from a Boston newspaper and one from an Omaha newspaper, about her trip, contemporaneous, published in the 1890s. And I wrote back to this fellow on my mom's behalf, and I said, it's clear you found the right family, but I wish we could help you, but no, we've never heard of her. So I took the materials, I put them in a file folder where they sat for 10 years. And in 2003, this same fellow wrote back to me and he said, I dropped this project. I'm sort of back on it now. Have you learned anything since we last corresponded? And I had asked members of my family, particularly older members of my family, about this. Everyone drew a complete blank. No one had ever heard of her or of this bicycle trip. So I decided in 2003, this sounds like a great story. I should poke around a little bit and find out what I could. And I decided the first call I made was to the library at the Massachusetts State Capitol, which is where the trip began, because I thought maybe they would have some record of it. And to my surprise, the woman who answered the phone, the librarian, without even hesitating, said to me, "We don't have anything about her." And I said, "How do you know? I just called you, 5 seconds ago." She said, "I had an inquiry about her a few weeks ago from a man in Texas." Well, I was stunned because this story there was nothing on the internet. It was just a blank. And I thought, well, who in the world is this fellow in Texas and what's his interest in this story? She gave me his email address. His name was Dennis McCown. I thought maybe he was a long lost cousin, but he wasn't. And when I emailed Dennis and told him I was interested in this story and that I was a descendant of this woman, he wrote me back this note. And he said, "Oh my God, a relative of Annie Londonderry's." And we quickly established we weren't related. But I asked Dennis, of course, when we got on the phone, I said, "How did you get onto this story? Nobody knows about it." And he told me a story I'm going to tell you now, because it's what really got me hooked. Dennis was researching another story completely about an ancestor of his own, a woman who lived in El Paso in the mid-1890s named Helen Morose, who was married to a ne'er-do-well named Martin. And Martin was arrested on a cattle rustling charge in El Paso. And to escape the law, he crossed the river into Juarez, Mexico. And they needed a lawyer. Helen, his wife, needed a lawyer to help him. Now, I know you're going to wonder what in the world this has to do with my story. Trust me, it does. So Dennis was researching this story, and it turns out that Helen hired a lawyer by the name of John Wesley Hardin. John Wesley Hardin was one of the most notorious outlaws of the Old West. By the time he was in his early 20s, he'd killed at least 24 men. That's the official count. By his own account, it was more than 50. He had spent half his life in jail, and he was now, appropriately enough, practicing law in El Paso. So Helen hired Hardin to represent her husband, and they quickly fell into a passionate affair. And on a night in July of 1895, 4 law enforcement officers employed by Hardin lured Martin back to El Paso and had him murdered. They murdered him at the El Paso city dump. And I'm thinking, Dennis, what does this have to do with this Annie Londonderry story? And he said, well, I wanted to figure out where was Hardin on the night of the murder. And he found out that Hardin and Helen were sitting in a theater listening to a young woman from Boston who was going around the world on her bicycle. This was a year into her trip. And when Dennis told me that my Jewish great-grandaunt from Boston had crossed paths with John Wesley Hardin, I was completely hooked. I said, this is unbelievable. What a great story. So Dennis shared with me articles he had found from the El Paso papers, because Annie was quite famous at this point, a year into her trip. and she got tons of newspaper coverage. And one of the articles he sent me gave me a very important clue that got me on her trail, because it said that she had left town pedaling north following the Santa Fe railway tracks. I had no idea of what Annie's route was. So using that clue, I started calling libraries in little towns all along the Santa Fe, telling them I was looking for stories in the newspapers. I didn't know if they existed. I said, I want to know if your local paper, and I gave them a time frame, has anything about this cyclist named Annie Londonderry. And sure enough, every library I called, after a week, they'd do some they look at old microfilm. Every time they were coming up with stories, so I was able to start pinpointing her route on a map. But again, this was a year into the journey. As I mentioned, and as Valerie mentioned, 4 years of research culminated in this book in 2007. I was encouraged by some people back then, publishers, to write this as historical fiction, because the historical record was somewhat thin, but I felt that if I did that, since this story was completely unknown, it would kind of remain buried. Nobody would know what had really happened, what was fact, what was fiction. So this was a completely nonfiction account of that trip. Fast forward to 2019, the New York Times, which has been for several years doing a series of obituaries called Overlooked, and these are obits about women and people of color primarily, who the Times went back and felt that they had overlooked them in their day. I didn't know this was in the works. It was a complete surprise to me, and a lot of it relied on that first book. And my wife, Judy, who's really behind almost every decent idea I've claimed to have had, said, and she's very tied into the book club world through her work, she said, you've got to rewrite this story as historical fiction, because all the book clubs I work with want to read historical fiction about women. They want to learn something about a different period in time, and you've done all the research. So I try and accommodate Judy whenever I can, but I'd never written fiction. And I thought, okay, I'm going to humor her. I'll write 20 pages. It'll be terrible. I'll send it to my agent. She'll confirm that it's terrible, and we'll be done with it. But she encouraged me to keep going, and that's what resulted in Spin. Now, Spin has an unusual connection to Bend, Oregon, because the cover was designed in Bend by Face Out Studio. So I don't know if anyone is on tonight from Face Out Studio, but thank you for this brilliant cover. And I just want to tell you that they also designed the cover to my last book before that, about this cross-country trip I made with my beloved and late Albie, inspired by John Steinbeck's Travels with Charlie. So hello to Face Out Studio, and thank you for these great covers. So who was the woman at the center of this story? She was born Annie Cohen. She was my great-grandfather Bennett's sister. She was born near Riga, Latvia around 1870 and came to the United States as a young girl. By the time she was in her late teens, she was married to an older man, somewhat her senior, named Max Kopchovsky, a Ukrainian immigrant. She had never ridden a bicycle except for a couple of lessons before she set out to go around the world on one. As you're going to see, this is a rather impulsive and eccentric woman at the center of this. One newspaper described her as an inventive genius. She was, in fact, a brilliant self-promoter and a masterful creator of her own myth with a casual relationship with the truth, which I'm going to talk about. And this really was part of her genius, was she knew how to spin, dross into gold as far as the newspapers were concerned. One of the most stunning discoveries I made early in my research was a small item in the New York World newspaper. And it was the only one out of probably a couple of thousand articles about her that I've collected from all over the world that mentioned this fact, that when she left on this trip, she was a young mother of 3 small children at the very tender ages of 5, 3, and 2. Now, this really shocked me, but at the same time, as I thought about it, I said, well, this is actually really great news for me, because I figured if those children had children of their own, those children might still be alive and I might be able to find them, and maybe somebody knows a lot more about this story. And that was what prompted me to hire a specialist in genealogy to track down any direct living descendants. And we did find one. Get to that. Now, to give you an idea about how fanciful Annie was in terms of explaining who she was, and she took great liberties both with explaining who she was and where she had been and how she'd gotten to certain places. At various times, she told reporters that she was a Harvard medical student. This was one of her favorites. I was quite naive. I called Harvard looking for her transcript, only to find out that women weren't admitted to Harvard Medical School for at least another 50 years. She claimed to be a lawyer, an accountant, a wealthy heiress, an orphan, the founder of a newspaper, the cousin of a congressman, the niece of a senator, in the days when you might have actually bragged about that. None of this was true. As I said, she was an inventive genius. She knew how to capture people's attention. Annie grew up in this neighborhood in Boston. If you're familiar with Boston, it's where Massachusetts General Hospital is. This small, compact neighborhood was, in the 1890s, the most diverse neighborhood in the United States. Cheek by jowl, you had communities of the Irish, Poles, Jews, African Americans, and a young girl growing up in this neighborhood would have had her imagination fired by hearing many languages spoken, smelling the aromas of international foods. So if someone was dreaming about life beyond the boundaries of this little ghetto almost, this would have been a place to fire your imagination about the world at large. As I mentioned, she was married as a teenager, had 3 young kids. By the time she was in her early 20s, the next image, I don't know that it was specifically that she inspired it, but it appeared in Punch magazine the year after her trip, and it's an absolutely perfect depiction of her life. She had these 3 kids. She was really not particularly cut out for motherhood, and the bicycle would become her means of escape. But what set this all in motion? It was widely reported all over the world in almost every newspaper account that this trip originated with a wager between 2 wealthy Boston merchants that a woman couldn't get around the world on a bicycle. Substantial amount of money was wagered. There were conditions. The woman, she had to make it around the world in 15 months and ride at least 10,000 miles on the bicycle. She had to be in without a penny and earn the substantial sum of $5,000 en route by whatever means she could devise. The notion here being, this wasn't just going to be a test of a woman's physical endurance and mental fortitude, but of her ability to fend for herself in the world at a time when the women's equality was being hotly debated, which I'll come to. And she was to win a substantial prize if she succeeded. Now, I want to move to the social historical context. Important to understand this because Annie built her fame at the intersection of 3 powerful social trends that were sweeping the country and really the world at this point. One was that this was an early era of globalization. You could sail from New York to France in less than a week. The telegraph was transmitting news around the world in a matter of hours or minutes. And so those people were growing because of these changes. The world was figuratively shrinking, and most people didn't have the means to travel internationally. So people who made high profile adventures around the world became objects of great fascination, kind of like the reality television stars of today. This was also the peak of the bicycle craze, both in Europe and the United States, where millions of people were riding. It became the most popular form of recreation. And the third was the women's movement for social equality and suffrage. And women, and I'm going to touch on each of these 3 in turn, but collectively, these women, these sort of modern women, were referred to in the press as the new woman. That term will come back again. So just quickly about each of these. This era of globalization and the fascination that it engendered led to the creation of Jules Verne's novel in 1872, Around the World in 80 Days. And this is kind of the genealogy, if you will, of Annie's trip in a way. If you remember, Phileas Fogg, who was a fictional character, wagered $4,000 that he could make it around the world in less than 80 days. And this was a fictional adventure, but there were many factual around the world adventures in the late 1800s as well. Thomas Stevens was the first person to go around the world on a bicycle, on a high wheel bicycle like the one you see here. But the most famous of these round the world journeys was taken by Nellie Bly, the most famous journalist of her day, male or female. She pioneered the field of investigative journalism, but she was what was called then, there were many women who were called stunt journalists. And one of her stunts was a publicity stunt for the New York World, Joseph Pulitzer's flagship paper, in which she said that she would go around the world and beat the record in Around the World in 80 days. And she wrote about it as she traveled, and millions of people followed her adventures in the newspapers as she did, and she broke that record. It was such a sensation that when she returned, the McLaughlin brothers produced this board game based on her travels, became a best-selling board game. Almost any person who could read, and that would have included Annie, who would have been, in her early teens, early to mid-teens at this time, would have been very familiar with Nellie Bly's journey. Now, that's the social historical piece, part of it. Then there's the bicycle craze. So until the 1880s, the only bicycles that existed were these so-called penny farthings, named for the British coins. The penny was the big one, the farthing was the small one. These were very difficult bicycles to ride. So it was primarily men who were riding in those days, and they were quite dangerous to ride as well. But what opened the sport to women was the change in technology to what was called the safety bicycle. So-called because they were literally safer to ride. And they, as you can see, the geometry of the safety bicycle is very much the design that we are familiar with today. And instead of directly turning that front wheel with the pedals, they were directly connected. These bicycles had a chain drive to transfer power from the pedals to the rear wheel. So this opened the sport to women in a big way. And the bicycle literally became a freedom machine for women. It also challenged every Victorian convention that was closely held about women. And so as a result, there was a huge debate over whether it was appropriate for women to even get on a bicycle and, be sweating on a hot summer day in public or showing, too much leg on the bicycle. And even doctors got in on the debate. Some argue that women who rode bicycles would become infertile. Some argue that riding the bicycle would be too sexually stimulating and therefore would corrupt the morality of young women. But the bicycle, and you're going to see Annie's clothing undergo an evolution that kind of mirrored how the bicycle brought about changes in how women dressed. So getting a bicycle really was a woman's declaration of independence, and advertisers capitalized on both women's interest in cycling and on their desire to keep their femininity but still participate in the sport. And you can see it in these old advertising posters, which clearly, this is the woman as goddess. This is these are very, you don't have to become a man to ride a bicycle. It's basically part of the point. In time, the bicycle became a symbol of the women's suffrage movement, and truly, you cannot overstate how radically the bicycle changed the lives of women at the turn of the century. And Susan B. Anthony, in an interview with Nellie Bly the year after Annie's trip, declared that bicycling had done more to emancipate women than anything in the world. So this is the sort of the last piece. I'm going to take you somewhat through this trip as in very abbreviated form. It begins in June of 1894 here at the steps of the Massachusetts Capitol. There were about 500 people were there, suffragists, curiosity seekers. Annie lamented to one reporter who was there that her brother Bennett, my great-grandfather, didn't come up to say goodbye. And I suspect he probably thought she was crazy, that she probably wouldn't get very far before she turned around and came home. And more to the point, Annie's family and her young children lived at the same address as my great-grandfather and great-grandmother and their then two children, young children. And I suspect that a lot of responsibility for Annie's kids was about to fall onto my great-grandparents. Now, a year into my research, the genealogist I had hired that I mentioned, after many twists and turns, said, I think I've got it. Cohen is a very common Jewish name, and Kopchovsky is not a common name, but many people abbreviated their names. But she found Annie's burial plot in New Jersey. And the records for that burial plot had a contact name, a woman named Mary Goldiner in Larchmont, New York. I had never heard of Mary. I didn't know if she was a relative. I didn't know if she would want to hear from me, but I wrote her a letter. And I didn't even know she was still alive, frankly. I wrote her a letter. I explained how I was related to Annie and what I was interested in. And 10 days passed, and then the phone rang one night, and I answered it, and this voice came on. She said, Peter, this is your long-lost cousin, Mary. It was Annie's granddaughter, her only grandchild, her only direct living descendant. I almost fell off my chair with excitement because I thought this is going to open up, hopefully, a whole new, area of research. And a week later, I was in Mary's living room in New York. I had never seen a photograph of Annie, but I knew she had a formal portrait taken because it was reported in the Boston newspapers. And she had this picture, which was the formal portrait Annie commissioned on the day she left Boston. And there are a few things to point out in this picture. That's a women's Columbia bicycle. It weighed 42 pounds, which is a Sherman tank by modern standards. Note the clothing that she was expected to ride in, not only around the corner, but around the world. And look at the rear wheel. I'm going to show you a close-up of this in a second. This is an important piece of the story. That chain link that you see there is what was called a skirt guard, and that was designed to keep a woman's skirts from getting caught in the spokes as they turn. But attached to it is an advertising placard. Londonderry was the name of a spring water company, the Londonderry Lithia Spring Water Company of Nashua, New Hampshire. They were her first corporate sponsor. This is, as best as I can determine, and I've looked, the first example of a woman engaged in what we call sports-related marketing. This was one of the ways she was going to earn money. They paid her $100 to carry the advertising placard, and she adopted the name for two reasons, I think. One was commercial, but the other was that the name Londonderry would help obscure her Jewish heritage. Traveling as she would be at a time, like, for example, in Paris, where anti-Semitism was virulent at the time, she wouldn't necessarily have to address questions about being a Jewish woman. This is an example, but actually the only one I was ever able to find of it when she reached Denver, well into her trip. This is an example of how the Londonderry Lithia Water Company used her image and her journey to promote the water. Now, this is my favorite description from the Boston newspapers of Annie's departure. It says, then carrying only a change of clothes and a pearl-handled revolver, Miss Londonderry sailed away like a kite down Beacon Street. So two things. I love the Mary Poppins image of this kite sailing down the street, but more importantly, this pearl-handled revolver, something she probably was even less familiar with than the bicycle, but she showed that revolver to almost every reporter she talked to, because she was all about trying to create a tremendous sense of drama around this trip. Fame was going to propel her, and it conveyed a sense of the danger that she faced as she would travel as a woman alone around the world. So she often made use of it as a prop in her storytelling. Annie was, as you might imagine already, fairly impulsive, not a lot of advanced planning about this trip, and she was headed to Chicago via New York. And she arrives in New York about a week after her departure from Boston, and this is how she was depicted in the New York World newspaper. And then it's on to Chicago. But it takes her 3 months of the 15 months she's allotted just to get to Chicago, because she was in clothes that were completely, just not suited for riding. She's on this enormously heavy bicycle. She's not really in shape. And by the time she gets to Chicago, it's pretty clear she's never going to make it across the plains and the Mountain West before the winter sets in. And so she dilly-dallies in Chicago for a few weeks, and she finally announces to the press that she's giving up the round the world quest. She's going to just try and set a speed record riding back to New York to save face. But then a couple of things happened. And before I tell you what they were, I want to explain what you're looking at. When I met Mary, Annie's granddaughter, her husband, who's a physician, came home late in the afternoon. We met, we shook hands. He went down the basement. I had read in numerous newspaper accounts I'd collected that as Annie lectured in the latter part of her trip, as she crossed the United States, like in El Paso, she actually had a slideshow. There was a way of projecting images on a screen. These are called lantern slides. They're 2 inches thick, 2 plates of glass with gelatin in between. And Mary's husband goes down the basement. He comes up with a couple of boxes. And when I opened them, I was absolutely stunned. And Mary didn't even know she had them. This was the original slideshow. It had been shipped around the world from point to point by steamship and by train, and had been sitting in Mary's basement for about 100 years. Eventually ended up in her basement, but they've been sitting in boxes for 100 years. And this was one of those slides. It was a photograph that she had made in San Francisco of the new bicycle that she had acquired in Chicago. And this is one of the things that encouraged her to actually continue the around the world venture. It was a man's Sterling bicycle. Okay, it's got that top tube, weighed half as much as the Columbia, 21 pounds. And it was really a top of the line bike. But because she's on a man's bicycle, she can't wear those long skirts anymore. So you see the first evolution in her clothing into bloomers, the divided skirt, as it was called. And this image was used to advertise Sterling bicycles in various cycling periodicals. So she announces to the media, well, I am going to go around the world after all, but she's now going to do it going eastward. She's got to go retrace her steps back to New York, having wasted 4 months out of the 15 getting to Chicago. But now at least, if she gets back to Chicago, she's made the circuit. I showed you the Londonderry placard. One of the primary ways she made money is she would ride into a town like Buffalo, and she would literally rent space on her bicycle or on her body to local merchants who would hang, she would stitch little advertisements on her sleeve or on her bloomers on her back. And she had a rate card. It would, depending if her back was $300 for the week, her sleeve was $100, whatever. But the Buffalo Express called her a riding advertising agency. And this picture, it's not very clear, but it was in the newspaper. The reason her sleeve looks white is that's an advertising banner of some kind that she's wearing. I'm skipping a lot, but in the interest of time, she gets back to New York and she sails to France on a French liner. And the only point is she rides from Le Havre in the north through Paris to Marseille. And I can't go into the detail because of the time, but what I really want to point out here is that in France, to tell you how profoundly she challenged gender expectations, this is a portrait of her taken in Chicago, and you can see she was a very feminine, attractive woman. But when she gets to France, she's now more muscular because she's now got about 1,600 miles of riding. She's now wearing more masculine clothing. And as a result, she's just perceived completely differently. And this is actually a stunning quotation from one of the newspapers in France that's describing her. It says she belongs to that category of neutered beings, single women without a husband or children, little did they know. The suppression of love and maternal function so profoundly alters in them an effeminate personality that they're neither men nor women and really constitute a third sex. I mean, just imagine, this would drive Governor DeSantis insane. This is a depiction of Annie in one of the French newspapers, and you can see it's a much more masculine image. And I just also point out to you on her right knee and her left thigh, those are supposed to be little advertisements that she's carrying for local merchants. Annie boards a steamship in Marseille, and she more or less skips like a stone across the water. When I was first researching this story, I thought it was my job to document and prove that she had the right to claim to be the first woman to cycle around the world. But there got to be a point when the timeline just wasn't adding up, and I really struggled with this. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I actually have a more interesting character, a more complicated character on my hands here. She was a bit of a fabulist for sure, and she, a spinner of incredible stories. But she makes it to Asia right as the war between China and Japan over control of Korea is winding down. And in this war, she sees opportunity to gather material for the lecture tour she hopes to give when she returns. And so she collected lantern slides like this. You could purchase them like postcards of various battle scenes that she would use to illustrate these lectures in towns like Phoenix and Tucson when she got there. Now, this will give you an idea of what a sensationalist she was. When she wrote her first-person account for the New York World, and these were the kinds of stories she told when she lectured. You can read it. I said, well, in prison, she claimed to be taken prisoner and then saw a prisoner executed before her eyes, and they were drinking his blood while the muscles were still quivering. This was the kind of gift for over-the-top sensationalism that was very much desired by the newspapers of the day, who were competing, the Hearst papers and the Pulitzer papers to see who could top the other one. I mean, this is obviously completely over the top, and I don't know whether people who came to her lectures bought all this, believed all this, but it almost didn't matter, because if you were living in Tucson, where there were 3,000 people, and most people had never traveled outside of that area, this was an incredible evening's entertainment by this woman who had arrived on a man's bicycle wearing a man's clothes. She takes a steamer from Japan. She arrives in California in the early spring of 1895. This is how she's depicted in the San Francisco Examiner. To give you an idea of how impulsive she was and how little she really cared about keeping to a consistent narrative of her own story, she told two completely different stories to two different reporters on the same day about how she arrived in California. To one, she described an arduous overland trip across India and China. And to the other, she said, I came on the steamer. She was about building her fame. And truly, that was no small accomplishment in and of itself. And this was one of the lantern slides that was in the collection taken outside of San Francisco. Again, you can see her gift for showmanship here. Hires these actors to stage this robbery scene so that she can weave these stories for her audiences of great danger that she encountered along the way. But the other thing to note in this picture is that the next step in the evolution of her clothing, this is actually a man's riding suit. So imagine, you're in some little town in New Mexico, Arizona. This woman arrives on a man's bicycle covered with advertisements, wearing men's clothing, and she's carrying incredible stories of adventure. It took Annie 6 weeks to ride from San Francisco to LA, a trip that could easily have been made in a week or 10 days. And I think the reason is that she was in the company of a young gentleman rider from San Francisco. I have no direct evidence that there was a romance, but I strongly suspect it. Why else would it have taken them 6 weeks to cover a week's worth of ground? From Los Angeles, she heads east for El Paso, where she's going to have that encounter with John Wesley Hardin. And this image accompanied her first person account in the New York World, which I showed you a little bit of before. This may look a little bit fanciful, but when roads were impassable, cyclists often did have to resort to literally riding the rails. But in the great expanse of the Southwest, I mean, it's pretty wide open today. This was the way that a cyclist would make sure they didn't get lost, was to follow the railway tracks. And if you had an emergency or a breakdown, eventually a train would come by. But I also want to point to the very bottom of the picture, because you'll see that the byline that she was given for this article was not Annie Londonderry or Annie Kopchovsky or Annie Cohen. It was Nellie Bly Jr. After the Nellie Bly had made that famous trip. I have my theory on why that's so. I'll tell you about in a moment. But just to cover a lot of ground, because of the interest of time, she gets to El Paso, and now she's going to head north. You realize that this route now has taken her around the mountains of the Cascades and the Rockies for a flatter route. Because obviously it would have been more direct to go San Francisco to Denver. And then she gets to Chicago just shy of the 15 months that she was allotted by the terms of the wager. So this is the headline this was the only first person account that she ever wrote of this trip, to my knowledge. It took up an entire page of the front page of the special Sunday feature section. And you can read the headline for yourself. You know, again, this is what they call yellow journalism, the sensational journalism. The New York World, by the way, if the newspaper you would have gotten if the New York Times had acquired the National Enquirer. It was kind of a combination of a serious newspaper of record and an over-the-top sensational broadsheet. But Nellie Bly Jr., I think, and this is my suspicion, the real Nellie Bly was at war with her editors at the New York World at this point. And I think this was their way of saying, we've got another. And in fact, Annie would go on after this bike trip to write a whole series of sensational features for the world on different topics, often bylined NB Jr. or sometimes the New Woman. The lead of this story, and then I'm going to wrap up, this is how that story begins. It says, I am a new woman if that term means that I believe I can do anything any man can do. And when I met with Mary, I said, do you think, and she knew her grandmother quite well. Her grandmother lived until Mary was 16. I said, did you think of her as a feminist? She said, you know, she wasn't a feminist in the sense that she was marching for women's rights or getting signatures on petitions. You know, in fact, she kind of took advantage of the women's movement to build her fame. But she said to me, but I think she was a feminist in the sense that she believed in a woman's right to control her own destiny. And I think that's about as good a definition of a feminist as you could imagine. Annie returns to her husband, Max, after this trip. They have a fourth child about a year later. And this is Annie and the most patient husband in the world, Max, in the 1940s. Shortly before, he died in 1946, and then Annie died the next year in 1947. So that's the whirlwind version of this story. Thanks for being here. And Julie, if you want to open it to questions, we can do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, if you have a question, you can put it in the chat. You can use the raise hand function. I did want to point out, because this is something, I'm not usually a numbers person, but I hopped on my phone real quick and I found a conversion. If this is to be believed, $20,000 in 1894 is $660,000 now. So that's quite a bet. And I think there are many of us who would have taken that on for that amount of money. So that is, I mean, it's an interesting thing to think about. You know, that's a large sum of money.
It was a large sum of money.
Yeah. So, so Christine, who is on and just put a comment in, is one of our new booksellers. And she says, this is a fantastic story and I love seeing the images as well. And I know we've had quite a few people pick up the book this week. So if they're not on here, hopefully they'll check out the recording. So I guess, Peter, tell us, maybe you did cover it a little bit, but when you did the nonfiction, what was then finally the one that you're like, I'm going to totally fictionalize it and fill it in? Like, what was kind of the impetus of that?
Well, it was my wife ordering me to do it, basically. But look, the little tagline on Spin is based on a mostly true story, and now it should be apparent why it's a mostly true story. But I realized, that I was writing historical fiction about a woman who was writing her own historical fiction in real time. But I also don't want to diminish this too much, because she was a bit of a rogue, should we say. I mean, what she accomplished for a woman of her time, whether she can claim to be the first woman around the world on a bicycle or not, this was quite an undertaking for a woman alone. Figuring out how to navigate and negotiate her way around the world while earning, her own way, and literally becoming famous without the advantages of social media. But when Judy said to me, look, what really got me going is probably when she said, if you don't write it, somebody else will. I think I feel kind of proprietary about this story. So I said, oh yeah, you're right. Maybe I better get going on this. And so the arc of the story is very much the same, but I gave myself so many liberties in writing the novel, obviously, create dialogue. Mm-hmm. There are characters she meets along the way that she may or may not have met. And it allowed me to fill in the story in certain ways. There's what's true, there's what's not, which is what's demonstrably false, but also a middle ground of what's plausible. And the book is written in the form of a long letter to her granddaughter, Mary, written later in life. And it didn't dawn on me when I was writing it, but it did after the fact that in all the years that I was living with Annie in my head, which was a long time, what I really would have wished for, or did wish for, was a day when I could sit down with her and have her tell me her story directly. So I think in a way, this was my way of doing that, step into her shoes. I mean, some people might think, well, how can a man pretend to step into the shoes of a woman and write from her perspective? But it wasn't that so much. I just felt like I'd come to know her in a way, really well. And so that's what I think, people can decide for themselves whether it was successful or not. But what I think allowed me to somewhat inhabit her character for a while. And, it was hard for me because I'd never written fiction to give myself the liberty sometimes of breaking away from the historical record. Like I wanted to have her meet Susan B. Anthony. I found out there had been a women's conference in San Francisco. And I thought, oh, great. But it was 2 months before Annie got there. I thought, oh, I can't use that. And then I thought, yes, I can. I can, when I'm writing fiction, I can move that event. I'm not bound by the record, which is sort of my instinct. So I think Spin is true to her character, very true to her character, even if parts of it are my own imagination.
Real quick, I just want to check with you. Do you know if the nonfiction, the Around the World on Two Wheels, is that still in print?
I don't think. Well, there isn't. I hate to send people to Amazon, but you have this print-on-demand version of it. Okay. It's actually quite nice. The only thing it's missing is the photo insert that's in the original. It's not in print, but you can get them.
It actually looks like you can get an audio version of it from libro.fm. So if you're on this or watching it later and you're not familiar and you don't want to use the other option for audiobooks, libro.fm is an independent audiobook resource that you can pick which bookstore. So for instance, in my account, my purchases on this go to Roundabout. So it's only $20 for an audio version of this, which is actually really, really good. Audiobooks are very expensive. So that's kind of interesting that you can still get that. But yeah, I wanted to just ask, because then obviously that goes back to how you found a lot of the, information about her was the original, that research, and then taking that and turning it into a fiction book. Valerie did ask though, if the letters from her friend Susie are real.
Okay. So in the book, she has a friend, Susie, with whom she has a romantic relationship. Susie was a real person. The romantic relationship is imagined by me. I mean, I think it's quite plausible. So those letters were not real. Some of the letters that are quoted from in the book are real and some are not. Some, the ones between her and Susie are from my imagination. But there are others that are quoted that are real.
So interesting. Well, we probably should wrap it up, but what I want to say is, should you find yourself out this way, please let us know, because we would love to have you back in the store. We could have you do a longer version of this, talking about the original nonfiction. Anything about dogs will get people around here interested. And then one of our very special customers who is on a lot of our virtual events, Linda, did ask a question in the chat that Valerie answered. So in case you didn't know how to find the sculpture for Annie Londonderry that Chris Cole finished, the directions are from Skyline Ranch Road, turn right onto Celilo, and then right onto Blodgett, and left onto Londonderry, excuse me. It's in the first phase of construction on the Discovery Park land. So yeah, so please go check that out. So exciting to have, a local company to design your cover. Kind of funny if we had imagined that she'd made it this way in a bike rather than going to California, but we understand it's cold, there's mountains. It's not always, the best for bicycling. But thank you again so much for everyone being here tonight, supporting us, supporting Brooks Resources, supporting authors. It's a relationship that we must continue. So thank you so much for being here. Have a great rest of your evening. Please come see us at the store. Continue reading. Peter, wonderful, wonderful talk tonight. Thank you.
I appreciate it.
Thank you, Valerie,
Thank you
for
so much,
everything.
Peter.
If
Thank
you
you,
have
Julie.
other ones that you hear about and you want to talk to us, you call me.
Okay, I will. Nice to meet you, Stephanie.
Have a great night, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.